Hello, what have we here?
Welcome to Cloud City Council,
I have been waiting for you.
where our host Rob and John talk all things Star Wars.
Wipe them out. All of them.
From the comic shop to the silver screen.
And here I thought we were friends.
Everything's perfectly all right now. We're fine. We're all fine here now. Thank you. How are you?
The Force is strong with this one.
Hey, welcome to, I was going to say welcome back, but it's been a while. Welcome to Cloud City Council, and this is a special look back episode, partially on the podcast itself, which we'll probably start off talking about, and then mainly on Star Wars Rebels, which just ended its season. You may have heard a voice in the background, and that is my, I don't know if I want to say former co-host, my current co-host for this episode, Alan.
Hey, what's up? And not just co-host, but we're friends. We're good friends.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah.
Hey.
Oh, yeah. We still talk Star Wars all the time. Every
Yes,
time there's
we
a new
do.
trailer, we're... What'd you think of that? Blah, blah, blah. And unfortunately, Rob couldn't be here today, in part, to be honest, because he's super busy. He has a lot of things going on in his life right now, which is fun. And also in part because he hasn't actually watched Rebels. And so he had no idea what he'd even say. So I was like, okay. Well, you know, you do a master's degree, things get a little busy, then you get engaged and blah, 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 you know, real life. But he wanted to be here, and you know, he sends his love as always. I'm sure he'll hate the fact that I said it that way, but that's fine. That's what he gets for not being here. But anyway, so this is a special episode. Normally, obviously, in this time slot, we have Fate of Heroes going out, but I hope you enjoy this. This was a podcast that we started, Rob and I did back at the beginning of 2015, I think, or maybe the end of 2014. I'm not exactly sure. Right around the time that the first teaser trailer went out, I think, in 2014. And then we went right up until the end, The Force Awakens, when it was released. I think the last episode we ever did was the actual Force Awakens rewind.
I think so. Yep.
And then we've had one other little segment that we did when I think it was Rogue One, because I begged and pleaded Webby to do one on Simply Unprofessional. So we did,
we did
sort of a mini-sode on Simply Unprofessional, which was a lot of fun, and we got to talk about my negativity towards a movie that I don't hate, but never loved. And
that little discussion was fun with Webby, and gosh, we had a group of us that time.
Yeah, I think Austin was on it possibly, or Devin. I don't remember who all was there, but it was pretty crowded. So I wanted to make this one as a little bit of a special episode where we just kind of just talk amongst ourselves, because, you know, this is kind of what we did for a while. And Rob and I, of course, started out doing Marvel comics. Alan and I were talking this just before the episode began, and kind of that was our niche that we thought we could tick out, and then we'd be Cloud City Council, which we thought was pretty clever. And then it turned out that somebody else came around and decided to go with Cloud City Casino. They probably didn't even know we existed at the time, to be fair to them.
Right.
And then, of course, people started doing the old Marvel comics because, of course, Marvel was republishing the comics. So they were all like, oh, hey. And actually, that was the whole reason why we started. It was because Marvel had gotten the IP back, and we're about to start releasing Star Wars comics. So we were like, hey, we'll talk about the old ones, because the old ones are fun, and talked about the old Dark Horse comics, and we went through those. And basically what I did was we had Rob read them as sort of a neophyte to the whole series.
That's awesome.
And then we sat down and sort of talked about it afterwards. And it was great fun. I really enjoyed those. I will admit, the driving force behind thinking about this, outside of the fact that Rebels had come to an end, and I was like, hey, yeah, this might be a good thing to talk about, was the fact that one of our fans brought it up and said, I miss Cloud City Council. And I was like, oh, yeah, it's been a while.
Well, and to be fair, I mean, a little history with you and I.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we started back when Rebels first kicked off.
Yep.
And we were doing a Rebels roundup with the Who Wars back in the day, and so this is kind of a bring it full circle and talk about Rebels now that it's come to an end, because we used to have discussions about it all the time. I mean,
yeah,
candid discussions about it.
Exactly, and what was good, what was bad. I'll kind of, especially comparing it to Clone Wars, which had been so recent at that point. You kind of had the Netflix series that ended it all kind of the year prior, I believe, and it was just such a. You got very used to the way the Clone Wars presented itself, and then you go to Rebels, and it was so jarring that it took a while for me to get into liking it, really. I mean, the first season was rough, I will say that. Loved the characters, didn't love the stories to start with. They were sort of hit and miss. Like the droid one was kind of for me. Some of them were good. Like I said, it really sort of kicked off for me at the end when they got Tarkin involved. And as soon as he came in, it felt like every episode was important and significant and had reason for being there.
Well, and then and you and I are opposite of each other, because you had your critiques of it, and then there was me that was just enamored by the whole thing. I just and you and I would feed off each other. You'd talk about the things you didn't like. I'd talk about the stuff that I just loved. And then, you're right. Season 1 was slow, but to be fair, you go back to Clone Wars. The first season of Clone Wars was pretty slow. It really picked up. Yeah. It wasn't until the second season when we got reintroduced to Darth Maul. We got reintroduced to one of Filoni's beloved characters in Ahsoka, and suddenly we're full force into these 2- and 3-story arcs on the characters, and it's like, man, you're doing it to us all over again, Filoni. You're doing it.
Yeah, and then he brings in Darth Vader, and it's James Earl Jones, and there's a lot of that I loved so much about that series. I think I would argue that season 2 is probably the best, because there was so much going on. There was so much lore and interest there. And they kind of got a little lost in season 3, I thought. I mean, there was great stuff there. There's no doubt about it. I think the biggest problem I have is I'm hugely into the myth.
Right.
And so the mystical stuff and the myth and the stuff that pushes, it's my whole reason why I struggled with Rogue One, to be honest, is that while there was aspects of the Jedi within it, there was no real myth making that kind of drove the story forward, which is what I always tell people. It's like, for me, you always have to have Gandalf. If you don't have the wizard in the story, especially in Star Wars, it's not as interesting as it would be if they had the wizard. And the wizard doesn't have to be the key driver of the story.
Just has to be an element.
Yeah, and I think that's what I liked about Rebels, is that they had the wizard, they had the Kanan character, they had Ezra, they had all these little things that changed. And I mean, when we talk about the ending of the series, I think they went right back to that.
Yeah, they did.
And I loved it. For me, that was my favorite parts of the series, is whenever they went into those kind of things. And I mean, yeah, there's other good stuff. I liked Zeb as a character, but he was not well defined.
Right.
I was never really enamored with the Mandalorian, who now I suddenly... Sabine, yeah. Her character was always one I struggled with. I didn't like the fact, and it's been brought up by other podcasters, that she's a little too Jedi-like for somebody who's not a Jedi.
Right.
And that part was always a little difficult to sort of understand why they would go that far. I mean, I get it. It's a kids-oriented show. They're trying to make, a boy who's very good and skilled and talented, and then they have a girl character who's skilled and talented, and I get that, and that's acceptable and all that, and I wasn't like, it didn't take me out of the moment when she went jumping on ships like she was a Padawan learner from the prequels, but at the same time, you kind of sat there and went, okay, well, if I was looking at this as an adult, not sure I like that. But I love the fact that they brought Ahsoka back. I like the way that they took her story forward.
Me too.
And now I'm kind of irritated, because it's like, well, now what? What are you doing with this character? Because every time it's like, okay, she's gone. Nope, she's not. She's gone. No, she's not.
all you have to do is go back to Celebration last year when everybody asked if she was actually gone.
Yeah,
you remember?
And then he came up with that shirt.
Yeah. You remember Filoni's response? He goes, "Well, she could be, and maybe she couldn't be." And
yeah. Well, he's so mischievous when it comes to that stuff.
No, he is, and I will be honest. I have no issue with the way they brought her back either. I mean, and we haven't even gotten into the final episodes of this season yet to talk about it, but I have no issue with the way they brought it back. The other thing that really blew my mind, and the more I think about it, the more I settle in. This goes back to your comment about Sabine. Sabine has a bigger role in this entire series than we realize.
Yeah.
And see it in the final stages of the final episode of the series.
Well, and I think it's funny, too, because I'll be honest with you, I started to like her in the last year. It was the first time where her character was defined. You knew who she was. You knew why she was doing what she was doing. You had a reason for why she was doing what she was doing. And to me, that makes a difference. There are other characters that we could argue about and say, but I really think they did her I think the last year was more her story arc than it was Ezra's in a way.
Agreed.
So I think that was a good thing, because I think that was the biggest problem she had, is she was paper thin for so many of the episodes before that. And
interestingly enough, like I say, we find out at the end of the series that the entire series was from her point of view.
Yeah.
Like, what? Really?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's supposedly the original Star Wars was all by the droid's point of view, so...
Exactly.
Yeah. So I have to say, I was listening to... so thanks to... I mean, I hate to plug another podcast, but I do it often enough, I don't really care. So I was listening to Rebel Force Radio the other day, and they were talking about this... this book that had gone to audiobook, where the guy does an absolutely spot-on version of George Lucas. And I was listening to it, and it's I'll try and find it here. Yeah, The Secret History of Star Wars.
Okay.
And I sat there listening to that as I was driving back and forward to one of my business trips. And my gosh, you don't realize just how much effort and influence was on the Star Wars story right from the very beginning. Stuff you wouldn't even have thought of. And you go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That would totally explain it. And just how influential so much stuff is still to this day. Like names that went away after the first couple drafts suddenly pop up again in the prequels and that kind of thing, and in the Clone Wars and in places and that kind of thing. It's so fascinating to me to sort of listen to that backstory, and kind of, when we do our own stories for our podcast here, I so often sit there and I'm just thinking, okay, what am I trying to write about? What am I trying to say? And kind of look at. And one of the things that always comes to mind is like, okay, well, my experience is this kind of movie, this kind of show, this kind of thing. How do I input that into my thinking? Because I want to do something like this, but not just basically do the same thing. And you start to realize that that's basically what George did. He started with Hidden Fortress and then just tweaked it and tweaked it and tweaked it and tweaked it, and brought in elements from people like Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and all this other stuff. And all of a sudden you have this very different movie than what he started with. And I see that with Rebels. You see the influence even today of that kind of stuff. Like even going into The Last Jedi, there's some of that too. And
I agree.
I think it's really cool. I don't think it's something bad. I actually think it's acknowledging, the person that made the series and made it what it is. And I think that's my biggest beef with the current ownership of Star Wars is the fact that I don't think they always reverence him enough. And I say that not always agreeing with his decision making. Not everything he did was covered in gold, and not everything he did was covered in crap. But,
well, and to be fair, Dave Filoni worked one-on-one and was mentored by George himself.
Yeah.
So if you ever want to get a guy who is as close to the real thing as there was, it's probably Dave Filoni.
Yeah, which is why I think so often when he's telling these long stories about the Jedi or about, the Force and all that, I feel really connected with that story. And when it's told via the current... well, I won't say this about Rian Johnson. I know a lot of people crap on him for reasons that some are valid, some aren't.
Right.
But I think they don't understand it as intrinsically. And I think that's what happens when you sit with somebody for 8 years. You get to know how that person thinks and feels about something. And you know it because George didn't not tell you. Because he was heavily influential and everything. And it's just, to me, it's really fascinating. And I think Dave Filoni could easily do a live action series or a live action movie and do it very much justice. And I would love to see him do it. But you know what? I'm happy with him doing the cartoons too. I think he does a great job with them. I would like them to slide a bit more adult and a little less Disney XD though, I think, next time. Because I think
Fair enough.
Clone Wars was much more adult. And I think it was actually served by that. I think the first season was a little kiddish. And, with the Roger and Ahsoka being all, Sky Guy and all that stuff. And then they started to get more serious and much more, not adult, but a little bit less, talking down to kids. And I think that made that series so much better. Because, if the point of the series was, and I think it was, to make Anakin the hero that we think he should be, then I think they did that. Whereas if you go just on season 1, you'd be like, oh my God, how can I watch this? And I think that's a huge difference. And I really respect that about Filoni, is that he's very good at that kind of thing. So I think if he's given the option of doing like a more sort of like Japanese anime, not style, but kind of the way they do mature storytelling along with sort of kid storytelling, I think it would be, you look at like Avatar, which he was a part of. I think that does that's a good measure of both of those things, because it's the right amount of kid friendly and the right amount of adult storytelling. And to me, that's what you want when you do a Star Wars thing. While it's geared towards the young, I don't think it should be so geared towards the young that the adult can't enjoy it.
I agree.
So, and I'm not saying Rebels wasn't that. I actually think Rebels was that, but certainly it was a little bit more Disney XD than, say, Clone Wars was. Because you certainly,
and I think even with Rebels, it took into the second season and then well into the third and fourth seasons before you started seeing maybe some more of the adult thematic ideas behind it. When did it truly get dark? Moraband? Moraband got really dark.
Yeah, it did. Any time they started talking about the dark side with Ezra, I think that made it a lot more dark, and they didn't do that for a while.
Agreed. Agreed. And that Moraband sequence, I think, and I loved it. I adored that one. That's one of my favorite arcs from this entire series. But once they got into that, you had Maul, you had Kanan lose his sight, you had Vader ride in on a TIE fighter and battle them, and that entire sequence to end season 2 was just crazy, incredibly good.
And I think one of my favorite parts of that whole thing is when she hits his mask and his face is exposed.
Yes.
And then you hear both James Earl Jones's voice and Matt Lanter. I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. Yeah, that was definitely Rebels at its best, in my opinion. I think that whole arc was tremendous.
Yes.
I can't say that about the one with Kenobi at the end of the day. I thought that was actually terrible.
The one with Kenobi and Maul, you didn't like that one as much?
No, I didn't. I thought it was not very good. And the simple reason was I think I always struggled with the idea that, these characters are sort of adjacent to what our main story is, and I didn't like the fact that we had Ezra go to Kenobi. I also thought that, I get what they're trying to do. They thought, like, I've watched enough about what they've said about it. They were like, well, we thought about making it this great big duel and all this, but we wanted to make it more like a gunslinger fight, where it's like one move and it's over, but all the prep is what's all the important part of it. But it's just like, at that stage, I'm kind of like, I don't know. It's kind of weird, because you don't want it to be too dissimilar to the way he's fighting in the original Star Wars movie. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, I don't know. We've watched Maul do very, very specifically crazy stuff, and then he just stands there, tensing up to take on Kenobi. Like, they fought several times in the Clone Wars. And, all through that, they were still doing the jumping and hopping and blopping. I get Kenobi's old, but, Yoda was, 800, 900 years old, and he was still doing all that. So I don't know. I realize it's, again, trying to move away from the prequels, which I always get a little knee-jerk annoyed with. But I think that was actually the weakest part of that whole thing. I think everything leading to that was great. Finding the Sith holocron, matching the two holocrons together, seeing the opposite side of the same thing, which I thought was brilliant. And actually, if you think about it in one respect, that thing with Maul and Ezra, where they see the same two sides of the same coin, is almost identical to what happens to Rey and Kylo Ren when they see each other joining each other.
Right.
And I thought that was really fascinating. So in retrospect, even at the time it was interesting, but in retrospect I really like that, because it's a good callback to that incident, even though obviously the movies aren't really influenced by the cartoon shows, I would argue. But
Right.
But I do think there is some cool things that they've done. I think the story group have done a very good job of helping sort of meld all these things together. I love the fact that they brought Forrest Whitaker in to voice his character from Rogue One.
Saw Gerrera.
Yeah, Saw Gerrera. And, of course, a character from the Clone Wars. I think it's really cool. And I thought the most wonderful thing about it is the way they were able to bring back all of these old characters and give them a voice again as themselves. And yeah, was I sad to see Yoda voiced? I wasn't sad to see Yoda voiced by Frank Oz. I liked that. But at the same time, it's kind of sad because there was another person who did it during the Clone Wars, and it's like, it would have been nice to hear him too. But I get why they were doing that. It's too bad that the character model was so bad. But other than that, yeah. And I mean, Darth Vader as James Earl Jones as Darth Vader, wow. I mean, that was super cool to hear him in that mode again. And you could also tell that they got better as time went on with that voice because, I mean, a guy who's in his 70s is not going to have the voice of a 30-year-old.
Right.
And so you could tell he had aged and his voice didn't sound, especially in the early going, but as they got further and further into the series, he sounded more and more like Darth Vader. And I noticed, and I suspect that part of that was because it's all prep for Rogue One and trying to use his voice in Rogue One.
Agreed. Well, and the other thing I noticed, too, is when they first introduced him, I think they tried to go with the raw Darth Vader, which, let's be honest, even James Earl Jones' voice, I guess, transformed with more clarity over the three initial movies, too. Because if you go back to A New Hope, it was very raw, very scratchy, very, very higher pitched even then, and it didn't really deepen and didn't really refine more until Return of the Jedi. So to do that in Rebels, I thought was fitting. I really didn't have an issue with it.
Oh, I didn't have I'll be clear. I didn't have an issue with it. I did notice it. That was all I would say. Where his voice was a little sketchy. It wasn't like honestly, I'm not criticizing that. I'm saying that's part of the way it was developed, I think. But I think it is cool, actually, I would argue, to see how they were able to turn somebody whose voice is obviously going to have changed over the years and make it back into kind of what we remember, which I guess really is probably the Empire Strikes Back version of his voice.
Right. I was going to ask you, since we're talking about episodes that we liked, how did you feel about the Mortis arc returning for the final episodes of Rebels?
I really like the idea that Mortis is something of, they're kind of the trilogy of the Jedi religion. And this concept that they're sort of this overwhelming force that still was, and I think the most interesting thing, and I think one thing that I would go into more deeply is it's interesting to me to note that the Mortis gods were all endemic through all the Jedi temples and the main Jedi temple in Coruscant, and yet strangely the Sith didn't know what it was.
Well, neither did the Jedi, because if you go back to the original visits by Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, and Anakin, they didn't even know where they were going, and it was like a portal jump, just like this was, and then they're back out of that portal jump, and it never existed.
Yeah, I get that. I don't disagree with that, but more the fact that the Jedi at one time obviously knew something about it, and knew enough about it to actually mark it and paint it and have it be a part of their temples and worship. I mean, there's lots of things like how... I mean, without jumping too far into historical weeds, because I could do this for ages, but if you look at it from the standpoint of history, there's lots of times when people, we look at stuff and we think, oh, it's that. But if you go back far enough, no, actually, it might be this. It's like, as an example, and this isn't to criticize any particular religious changes that have gone, just FYI. There's a character in history, in early Irish and Welsh mythology, who I think's named Brigid, and I could be kind of wrong on the name, so just if I get it wrong, don't kill me. Who was a god. She was one of the goddesses of the Celtic mythology of that island, in both Ireland and Wales, possibly in the rest of Britain as well. And over time, she becomes a saint in the Catholic religion. So what happened? Well, at some point, somebody said, hey, this isn't this, it's that. Well, maybe the symbolism for these people, the father, the daughter, and the son, changes over time, and they don't understand necessarily where it came from. Right? Like
maybe.
Yeah. For example, like in the Middle Ages, some of the people used to think that the Roman buildings in Britain had been built by giants because they couldn't figure out how they could do it. And they didn't understand where it come from. So to me, that's where I kind of see some similarities to that, is that if you lose the evidence of that, which over time you would, and if it isn't sort of a driving force behind how you understand your religious belief system, then all of a sudden that symbolism doesn't mean a whole lot, right? And over time, it changes and modifies and develops. And I think that's one thing I would argue probably happens here, is it's not that, the Jedi just either forgot or they lost track of what this used to mean. And because it's not said that, these got drawn after Anakin and Kenobi saw them. This was the way it's described in the episode. It feels very much like they've been around all the time. Well, I mean, Lothal, I don't think was an active temple during the Clone Wars.
No, I don't think so either.
Yeah, because that's the way it sort of feels. So, to my mind, that kind of says that this is a very endemic and very across all the Jedi. It's just that I think it's such a personal experience that it never got shared enough. That is my personal fan theory. But it would make sense to me based on kind of, if we're basing it on Earth mythology, that's kind of how it works, right? Like you'll lose track of what things are and were.
Right, and I'm going to build upon what you're saying too. Mm-hmm. I wonder if, this goes back to the destruction of the Jedi and of their dogmatic views and of the way that they had gotten. You look after the destruction of the Jedi, what we've started to see. We've seen it in comics. We've seen it in Rebels. We've seen it in the fiction that they've, the novels, books, and things they've been writing, like the acolytes and stuff. And then you read, they're doing all these different things, and you're suddenly realizing that the Jedi must have hoarded and hid all of this for so long, because what does Luke start to discover when he's out and about? He goes out in the adventures of Luke Skywalker, and he discovers some sort of a mythical Jedi-like temple in the stomach of a space slug, which, by the way, was one of the coolest stories in that whole book. Mm-hmm. But and I don't know if you've read that book, but it's just like Luke goes out on this mission for most of the time after Return of the Jedi looking for things. You go back to the comics, and he goes out following Return of the Jedi to obtain a Force tree. You now have in The Last Jedi, which we don't have to get into this, but you and I haven't talked about it a lot, but we have talked about our initial reaction. But one of my favorite Star Wars films to date. But you start to see different aspects of the Force that were not known before. Why? My opinion is the Jedi were starting to hoard it and hide it. And it wasn't until after the Jedi Order was destroyed that suddenly you start to see that, wow, there was a lot of power, a lot of ability, a lot of things out there that were not in the forefront because the Jedi chose to hide them, and rather than use them, rather than be a part of them. And I start to understand the Sith anger behind it, but then the Sith were just as bad because they wanted to hoard the power all for themselves. And the Force is a living entity. I mean, come on.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, if you read the comics, and again, this is going into if you read the comics, one of the things that's been made very clear, and I think they made it clear at the end of Rebels too, is that the Emperor's collecting all this stuff.
Yes.
And not to share it with anybody. He was collecting
exactly.
it. Yeah.
And that's really, in my opinion, the downfall of the Jedi. They were doing the same thing, but they were living in fear, if you will, mm-hmm. which is really quite ironic. But they lived in fear for 1,000 years to try and hide this existential, ethereal information, abilities, artifacts, whatever it might be, hide it away from the rest of the galaxy. And it became so mystical and never known about because they didn't want to reveal it and didn't want to let it out there for fear that it would get into the wrong hands. And it's like, what? And it eventually did, because the Emperor just scooped it all up and took it for himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it's really, I mean, we could do episodes on what the Jedi did and didn't do, and kind of what how like, I think the biggest thing that comes across to me, and I think this is what George was trying to put across in the prequels, is that the problems with the Jedi at this stage are just down to the fact that they're too bureaucratic, they're too stilted, they're not a free religious movement. They're basically just a cadre of insular monks who come out occasionally to enforce the law. And that an unwillingness to deal with the world, I think, is largely what created the problems. Because if the people can't connect with you, if they don't know who you are, then they have no sympathy for you. And so I think when things go wrong for them, there's, and you see it at the end of Clone Wars, they make it very clear that the population had grown very distrustful of what the Jedi were doing. And I think, again, this is why you need, if you've not watched these shows, it's really useful to watch them if you really want to understand the behind the scenes things that were going on, that were driving the movies forward, because so little can be covered in the movies, but you can cover tons when you have 7 years of TV episodes. And I loved Clone Wars. Clone Wars made me love the prequels. I will say, before Clone Wars came out, I loved Phantom Menace. I liked Revenge of the Sith, and had disliked with a passion Attack of the Clones. Right. But after Clone Wars came out and I started watching it, I really grew to appreciate the prequels and the story they were telling. Because, well, one, I don't mind the politics of it, which I know some people really didn't like. But two, I think it you get what George is trying to say, which is that these older systems of doing things had basically become so corrupted and so incapable of dealing with change that it just destroyed them. And, it's a problem in modern times. It was a problem in older times. It's a very human issue that things just kind of bloat, grow, and then decay. And eventually something overthrows it, and it's just a case of, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And we see that with the Empire. It bloats, grows, and then starts to decay, and then Luke overthrows it, and then the rebels overthrow it, and all of a sudden, they get a different kind of thing. Now, that happens in a much quicker fashion than the Old Republic, but still, I think there's a lot to be said about the fact that that's what George is trying to say in all of this, is that, change is a necessity. And I think that comes out of his mentality from the 60s and that, but I think it's a fascinating idea, and I think he did a really good job of kind of setting the table for, this is why Anakin isn't fully wrong in his opinions of the Jedi Masters, and that while what he does is wrong, his justification is not wrong. It just becomes slanted and evil because of what he does.
Right.
That's the difference between him and Ahsoka. Ahsoka says, you guys are corrupt and evil, I'm walking away from you. Anakin goes, you're corrupt and evil and you almost die, which is a totally different way of looking at it. And then, of course, he gets into thrall of Palpatine, which doesn't help. But I think they did a really good job of showing the two different decisions that two people had to make at a very similar time over very similar reasons. And I mean, the other thing I think the Clone Wars did a very good job of is building up yet another reason why Anakin distrusted the Masters. And, turning him from being this bright light, force for good hero into the angry, furious, pained person that we meet by the time we get to Star Wars. And I think this is why you got to watch these shows, because, man, you just get so much more when you watch them.
And what I love about it, too, is that we watched – we can talk about the different characters that have evolved over all of these things, Yoda being one of them. Yeah. We watched Yoda, who was probably just as – he was full of wisdom. He was amazing always. But I think he was one of those that was uniquely flawed during the Clone Wars era, too, where he was caught up in the old ways. But yet he was so full of wisdom and recognized – that the downfall was coming, and there was nothing he could do about it. Nothing at all. Yeah. And then we see in the Lost Missions season 6 of Clone Wars, where he starts to learn and understand more aspects of the Force that didn't exist before. You see him transition into what we saw in Empire and Return of the Jedi, and then holy crap, for the few moments we had him in The Last Jedi, that was, in my opinion, some of his finest work as a Jedi, because you finally saw him admit to the flaws and mistakes of the masters.
Yeah.
And it was like, whoa, talk about coming full circle.
Yeah, and I thought it was actually I thought the discussion that Luke has with Rey at one point in that movie where he's bringing up Palpatine, but he's not talking about him as Palpatine, he's talking about him as Sidious. And I know people are like, oh, why did you mention Sidious? How would he even know who that is? It's like, of course he'd know who that is. He's been reading about this stuff. He's been learning. He knew. You know, he's not a Jedi Master because he's the dummy. And he had access to the records because obviously Palpatine didn't get rid of him.
Right.
So, yeah, of course. And I mean, if you're talking about Vader and not Anakin Skywalker, of course you're going to talk about Sidious. So I thought it was really cool. And I love the idea that they called back to the prequels with that and how he rose and kind of what happened. And I to be honest with you, that's the thing. Watching Last Jedi, I felt really, while there was stuff in there where I was kind of going, what? I think Luke's comments and talk, when I first saw the bit where he says in the trailer, the Jedi must end. And I was like, oh, what? Oh, no, not again, Disney, please. And then I started to watch it, and I'm like sitting here going, well, of course that's what he's going to think. It makes perfect sense when you think about it, and you think about what he's watched and observed. So I'm going to be having a lot of fun watching this on video and digitally the next few months to kind of rewatch, because I think there's so much in there that in rewatching it in the theater, I was picking up different nuances I missed. But I think when you have time to sit down and really watch it again, especially with they have this really cool director's commentary with him, and I think it's with Mark Hamill, because it's the Jedi and the director, and I'm pretty darn sure that's going to be Hamill if there's another person.
Right.
And I've heard he goes way more in depth than most. Like apparently JJ's, I never did watch JJ's, but apparently it was basically just, these people are great to work with. Oh yeah, and these people are great to work with, and you're like, wow, that's really insightful. Whereas I hear that Johnson goes into lots of interesting details and dynamics, and I think that's way more fascinating. Like I really appreciate, like when I got out of that movie, I remember I sent a tweet to him basically saying, I loved the movie. It was great. Thank you so much for making a movie that I actually really appreciated. And I still feel that way. I think he's made a great film. I think the people that have problems with it, if the problems are, X, Y, Z, that's fine. And I mean, they have their right to think that way. But I'm not one of them. I think the film does a great job. Is there parts of it I'm not enamored with? Yes. I still don't like the Rey solution. I'm still hopeful that it's a lie, but we all know the Sith don't lie. So I'm pretty sure that at least, unless JJ flips it on his head, I think that may stay as what it is that she has no special parentage. She's just a kid from a bad family in a bad home. And if that's the case, I can accept that as long as we don't kill off the Skywalkers.
So I know somebody's going to hear this and probably come back to us later and say something, but one thing I haven't done yet is read the novelization of the movie.
No,
I have heard from a few sources and friends of mine who have read it already, and it is out already for anybody that wants to go read it. It's out already. You can go buy it. Written by Jason Fry, great author. But somebody mentioned that Luke has a wife, and somebody mentions that wife happens to be somebody that everybody would have hoped they would have done in the movie.
Well, I guess we'll hopefully maybe find out. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and I've already been told who it was. I mean, I don't know if I'd be spoiling anything, but I could hold back on it if you want me to. But it was just very intriguing to me. And if he did have a wife, and if it is who they say it is, it should make a few of the old
legacy
EU
people happy.
Yep.
Yeah,
the old EU fans happy.
So 3, 2, 1. You've been warned. It's spoilers. You can skip ahead about 30 seconds. Go ahead. Say it.
Mara Jade.
Of course, which is what I thought.
Yeah. So if that's the case, is it
Welcome
possible
back,
that
spoiler people.
Exactly. So if that's the case, is it possible for JJ to rewrite that story and make Rey his own? I don't know.
Well, he doesn't have to make her his own. I mean, I don't need that. I mean, I'd like that, but I don't need that. I
wonder how many people would be disappointed though if she ended up being anything other than nobody, because I think that's one of the
a lot of
things
people are. I think that was largely the reason why people were angry. Because I get the impression that the biggest thing that set people off was the fact that Luke was weird, and they weren't anticipating it because apparently they don't read enough spoilers, or saw all the spoilers leading into The Force Awakens and said he was going to be weird, or they didn't like the fact that Rey was nobody. And I mean, admittedly, I'm one of them. I don't like the idea that she's just a nobody because I'm kind of from the Anakin Skywalker school of the Force. You don't have a Force user that powerful that doesn't mean something. And people will go, but Anakin was a nobody. No, he wasn't. He was effectively created by the Force. That doesn't make him a nobody. I mean, if Rey turns out to be specially made by the Force, she's not a nobody. But,
Right.
And maybe the Force worked through those people. And if they did, great. But,
and I'm one of those people that was hoping that she was Luke's. I really was. And and if JJ decides to rewrite that story and bring her back as that, I'm not heartbroken by that. If they leave her as nobody, I'm not heartbroken by that.
Yeah.
And I felt like leaving her as a nobody in The Last Jedi was probably as compelling a portion of the story that was necessary as any. Because if she's a nobody, then the final scene of The Last Jedi means more than you could possibly imagine. That last scene with the young boy who uses the Force to grab the broom.
Yeah.
Suddenly that becomes an extremely deep and powerful moment in the movie.
Yeah. I think my frustration here, and it will, this is now going to bubble up, and we've talked about this, I know we did after the movie was over, is my concern is that going into The Force Awakens and coming out of The Force Awakens especially, I didn't see Kylo as redeemable, and not like in the Darth Vader version of redeemable, where basically he turns on his master, kills him, and we all get the he dies noble death sort of thing. I mean, that's not redemption. That's just basically being slightly less of a jerk, because he was still a massive villain. He just did something for the love of his son that he wouldn't have done necessarily for anybody else. He certainly didn't do it for Ahsoka. And so to me, that's great. I mean, that's great. I don't think that makes him redeemed instantly. It does at the end of Return of the Jedi because the way George did it. But I mean, it was supposed to wrap it up nice and neat, right? But I think in the end, Anakin may be sort of, deathbed redemption. But it's a lot harder for me after Kylo kills Han to see him as being a redemptible character.
Right.
Now, watching him in Last Jedi, I see it more.
As a redeemable character?
Yes, I do. And it's funny because you kind of think, no, he's even less so. But,
right. But see, and I'm one of those that thought, no, he's even less so. I thought for just a moment, I was like, oh, wow, they're going to make him to be some sort of a Jedi slash, dark figure, whatever it was, and they're going to do something with him. And then, nope. In fact, no, even more so that this guy might desire power and darkness even more than his grandfather did, even more than the Emperor did, even more than Snoke did, that he might be one of the most powerful dark side users we've ever known. That's what that was how I felt towards the end of the movie, and I'm curious to see in Episode 9 when this story arc finally comes to an end. But I don't find him redeemable at all. Yeah, I don't know where he'll be at.
Yeah, I know, and that's the question. See, because what I look at is I see him kind of in the Anakin role right now, where it's not that he's the worst ever. It's more the fact that he's broken and he doesn't know how to fix himself. And I think one of the disappointing facts of having Carrie Fisher die early is, in real life as opposed to on the movie screen, is that it made it so that probably what was going to be the redemptive arc got ruined. Because she was, the whole point was she was the one person he wouldn't kill. And
she didn't, and he didn't in the movie.
No, he didn't.
It's obvious that he didn't. And you even go back to Bloodline, and in the book Bloodline, and you understand the connection that he and his mother held.
Yeah.
While he was, or not Bloodline. Sorry, go back to Empire's End. That's what it was.
Okay.
The trilogy.
All right, I haven't read that one.
Because Bloodline, he was already out with Luke.
Yeah, he was with Luke. Yeah, because she was trying to talk to him and she couldn't catch up to him.
Right. So you go back to Empire's End, I think it was, because in Empire's End, she was pregnant, and there were scenes in Empire's End of that trilogy where you could see that she was connecting with her son, even more so in the womb than anyone probably should be able to, from mother to child. And you could tell that there was definitely a connection there, and they built upon that in The Last Jedi, They built upon that in the previous film. You can tell, and I've always believed that Kylo's redemptive arc would run through his mother. I've always believed that.
I think you're right, and I think that's one of the disappointing realities. And because they won't do any way have that character back, like either digitally or with a new actress or anything, I think it leaves them in a place where they can't. That's why they had to get a new writer and all the other stuff. I think it crossed everything up, and I think that's probably the two most frustrating things, I think, for me as an old Star Wars fan, is that we never got the trio back together, which I think was a complete disservice to the trio. And then we don't get the ending we all wanted, which is Carrie having her moment in the sun, because obviously all three of these characters are supposed to die by the end of the 3 movies. That's obvious to me based on the fact that 2 of them are already dead. And then, of course, the third one got all messed up. And again, as I say, through an unfortunate circumstance that, it's not, you can't stop yourself from being dead. But it's so sad because it's sad for her in real life, but it's also sad from a story standpoint. So, so for me, that's kind of where I look at it. And I think, that's a disappointing fact of it. I think if we had Carrie Fisher, I think so much would be so different. And I mean, that you can't do anything about it. It is what it is, and we have to live with the consequence of that sad situation. But I think it now makes it a whole lot trickier for the new writer to make a story in which this is going to work.
Right.
And my whole big thing is, and I guess this is where I got irritated about all this, is I don't like the idea of the Skywalker saga ending on a downer.
Right.
I mean, if Kylo basically ends up with a red sword down his middle, or, he has to be killed because, he can't be really redeemed, then what the heck are we going to do? Like, I get the idea that they're trying to put across that anybody can be a Jedi, anybody can be a Force user, but not anybody is the chosen one. Not anybody is this super important person who can hold the galaxy together and create myth. And I'm sorry, a Force Ghost version of Luke is not the same thing. And, as much as I like Luke and I want to see him back, and I'm glad that he'll be back as a Force Ghost, it's not the same, And I think I know people I talk to don't understand my point about this, but it's like the Jedi. If you have a Star Wars movie that doesn't really include the Jedi, I struggle calling that a Star Wars movie. That's one of the problems I have with Solo. I think it's going to struggle to be what I consider to be a Star Wars movie. I might enjoy it, and much like Rogue One, I enjoyed the movie, but I will sit there and argue with you about whether it's a proper Star Wars movie. Just because you put Darth Vader doing a bunch of, crazy, saber swinging killings doesn't immediately come across to me as, mystical and mythical and Jedi oriented storylines. I mean, if you want to make it about the Sith being the myth and mystical stuff, that's fine. But like that's where I've always struggled with the way Rogue One went, because there's just nothing there. And I get it. I mean, we're at a point where there's no Jedi around, supposedly, so you can't really have them going around.
And my favorite part of Rogue One, it was the mythical part, and that was, Chirrut, Imwe, and the temple there. But you didn't really spend a great deal of time with them, and that's the unfortunate part.
Yeah, and I feel like that was something that I think if they'd have gone into a little bit, it would have helped me sort of get it. But I get it. Gareth Edwards wasn't making that movie. And that's fine. I mean, like you said, Star Wars doesn't always have to be about me. I can like and dislike things and be just like everybody else. So, there are times when, like, you watch the Clone Wars or you watch Rebels. I know there's stuff that's not geared towards me. It's not really interesting to me. I don't really care for it. But I know my kids loved it. And I know sometimes other people like the Clone arc where they're on that planet, which is all pitch black, and it's all about this one Jedi basically going crazy, and the clones slowly starting to turn on him, I think was a really cool arc that I didn't like. But I know people who thought it was wonderful and loved the heck out of it. So, everybody has their own preferences. I like some things, I don't like others. That's fine. But like I said, I don't have to like it to think it's, a cool story or whatever, but don't tell me that I think it's Star Wars, because I won't necessarily. But But I know other people who think that Rogue One was the best Star Wars movie. So, But that doesn't mean I don't sit there and watch it and enjoy it. But I can honestly tell you this. I've seen it the least of any of them.
Yep, me too.
And it'll probably stay that way. I don't think I'll ever watch it the way I watched the other ones. In fact, I haven't even watched it since I got it on DVD. So, that tells you, in my mind, that tells you what I think of it. Whereas I know I'm going to watch Last Jedi because I want to know more. I love Force Awakens. It's a fun movie. And of course, I love to watch most of the others. I will say with Attack of the Clones, I skip over the romance. Because that is too intolerable for words for me, but that's me. I know when we've talked to other people, they've had a different opinions. Because, our Ring Theory buddy likes it and has all sorts of praise to talk about it, Mike Climo. But yeah, I can't get with him on that. The minute he talks about sand, I just go, what?
Yeah.
But, it is what it is.
I understand it. See, and I'm a big fan of Mike Climo, and I'm a big fan of his Ring Theory, and I'm a big fan of storytelling at its greatest, bringing things back full circle, connecting them all, intertwining them all, and that's what I love about the Lucasfilm Story Group is that they're able to do it. Are there flaws? Of course there
Absolutely.
are. Anytime you're dealing with a universe on multiple levels, from print media to movies to TV series, you're going to run into some flaws. It's bound to happen. There's no way around it. But it's still such a beautiful thing that they're able to do it the way they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with you. I think from the perspective of where we're at, and if we go back to the Clone Wars, the Rebels episodes again, and just to talk about the ending, I think the ending of that was probably one of the best endings I've seen. And it was funny because I couldn't see it originally because, of course, Canada, we didn't get the series at the same time as they did in the U.S. But I'm on Twitter, of course, and there's Star Wars fans on Twitter that are commenting. And I remember one of them, I don't know, our Star Wars fans might not know a lot of Doctor Who, but there's an episode of Doctor Who where you start off the episode and you just think everybody's going to die. Everybody's dead. It's just, they're all dead. And in the end, the Doctor finally says, just this one time, just for the heck of it, how about everybody live? And he does this thing and they all live. And so there's a gif of him dancing around in the rain from that particular episode saying, everybody lives. And they put it up there and I was like, oh, darn it, you spoiled this for me. But how the heck did they get there? and as you watch it, you go, how did they do that? That is amazing. And it's so well thought out in a way that gets Ezra off the field and yet keeps him around. It keeps Sabine around but doesn't put her in any of the movies. It gets Hera into where she needs to be. And, even though Kanan went before that, basically every other character is still alive at the end, which I know going into the series, we talked about the fact that we don't know who's going to live through this. And that is probably, I think, one of the best things Filoni did was he got us a series, much like Clone Wars, where we all thought Ahsoka was going to die, and yet she survives. And we go through Rebels, and we think she's going to die, and somehow she survives.
And not only does she survive, but we see her 20 years later.
I know. Well, I don't know if it's 20. I don't think that's 20 years later. No, it's not quite 20.
Later. It's probably more like 5 to 10, but still.
Yeah. I think it's probably 10, because I think when they did the math, I remember somebody saying that the years between Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back was between 2 to 3. And Return of the Jedi from Empire Strikes Back was a year. So that would be about 4 or 5, right? And I think if we were to look at it as it was, I'd say it's probably 5 to 10. I think you're probably right.
But that sounds right.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. I think it's really cool. And I'm curious about the Gandalf the White look she's got going on, because obviously that's kind of what he's used as his sample. And I love the fact that he then went, oh yeah, it means something, but I ain't going to tell you what it is. I think that was tremendous. So that ending was really cool. And it was a really good denouement on a series that I've loved and largely really, really like. So I think it's good. And I think I personally think it was a great reintroduction to a Disney-owned world, and still honored the maker in the process, which I think is what it needs to do. And I think in some ways Filoni was a better gatekeeper of Star Wars than the movie guys are. And I really respect his storytelling in ways that I don't even think the other movie makers have reached yet. Because he just, as you said earlier, he has that background of working with George, and it's just influenced his thinking. And I think that gives him a benefit of the doubt that nobody else gets, and it's a shame that he hasn't got a movie yet. To me, I think I'd have him doing a movie. And
is it that he hasn't got one, or is that he's turned one down?
Because
I wonder if that's something he really doesn't want.
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know whether that's it too, or maybe does he want an Ahsoka one?
Right.
Like, that's another thing I question. Is one of the Star Wars stories going to be Ahsoka?
Well, and then the other thing to look at is as a writer, you've just written a bunch of cartoon series, right?
Yeah.
Going to a movie is much grander. It's much bigger, and your storytelling and viewpoints and whatnot become much more magnified and critiqued on a grander scale than ever before.
Yeah, and realistically,
Dave
you have a lot less.
Really want that, or no?
Yeah, and you have a lot less time to build your story because you only have a 2 to max 3 hour time window.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, there's definitely some drawbacks to that I could see him himself not being excited about. I'd be interested to see if he does a live action movie or show, though. I think that'd be interesting.
I hope so.
Yeah, I think there's some cool things he could do still, and I'm really excited to kind of see where he goes with it and what they have him doing next, because obviously he's not done with them.
So no, and you know, the whole point of us getting together was to talk Rebels and to bring it around. I'm going to say too, the series was wonderful for me. I loved it all. There were some episodes that maybe didn't hit the mark for me as much, but there were some that were just incredible. From the Twilight of the Apprentice to the Moraband arc to the arc with, you know, and see, I loved the times that we saw Obi-Wan and whatnot, to the final this final season now. I've enjoyed seeing the Dark Saber episodes. Bendu, we talked in the past about Bendu. I loved the Bendu. And really, I just loved the way it rounded out with this final set of story arcs back on Lothal, where it all started. And I love the way that they took Ezra out. And the way that, again, from the point of view of Sabine, how we saw it all roll out and how it comes around. It was beautiful. It was so touching. Probably one of my favorite moments in the final stories was that of Kanan pushing Hera back onto the ship before dying. That one almost made me cry. Like that was
an amazing episode. Yeah, I think they did a really good job with that. I found it fascinating that they didn't tell anybody, not even Freddie, that this was coming. I mean, holy crap. That would have been amazing to watch. I mean, I've been in a situation where I've had a story that I was telling, and I didn't tell our players what was coming and sprung it on them, and their reactions were really visceral. So I can imagine that if you're in that situation and these guys come in and you really don't know how this ends, and all of a sudden they tell you, wham, this character that, you know, this guy that you've acted with for the last 3.5 years is going to die in this episode that we're recording right now. Like, holy cow. Like, that's pretty harsh.
And then the way that the two of them, the way that it focused on sight, on him seeing her.
And he turned his eyes blue again.
Well, yeah, but I mean, even when they spoke to each other in the scenes prior to that moment, where he talked about seeing her, where she talked about "You've always seen me," and they talked in that kind of allegory, only to have it really happen when he goes to save her, that his eyes change in the twinkling of a moment. He suddenly sees again, and then he's gone. It was beautiful. It was magnificent. It was incredible, and it hit me in all feels that night. Rebels, Dave Filoni, thank you, because you gave us yet another series that I will forever cherish.
Yeah, I'm really happy that he did that. I think it's a fascinating, great way to end that character arc. And, you know, out of all the ways he could have gone down, I think, hey, if you're going to be a Jedi, that's the way to go. I think what we're looking at is a very good series. It's been wrapped up really well. I think they did a really good job with giving him the send-off he deserved, and I think Ezra is an interesting and intriguing little plot thread that we have to figure out, and of course, what the heck is going on with Ahsoka, and I think it'll be tremendous, and I look forward to this continuation. I don't care if they tell me they're not continuing it. I believe they will be.
I agree.
And with all that said and done, just quickly as we wrap up, I just wanted to say, we did this series, or the Cloud City Council started as sort of an idea that we wanted to do. We didn't really have a good idea yet of what we wanted to do. We didn't know at the time kind of where the niche was that we wanted to be in. And as things changed and as the reality of the changes came about and we stopped doing the series, it doesn't mean that we've stopped talking to each other about it. I still talk to these guys about stuff as it comes out when new trailers come out. I'm always asking Alan his opinion because he's the one person I know has one on it. And I know when we got out of Last Jedi, we blabbed to each other for, I think it was a better part of an hour on Facebook, just going back and
easily.
forth. Yeah, and I think it's tremendous, and it's so much fun to talk to you. I really appreciate it, and I think I will still continue to look back at this whole thing very fondly because of the people that I did it with. So thank you very much for being a part of this and being a part of our initial Rebels Roundup or whatever it was we called it to start with. I think all of that was so much fun, and every time I think I'm out of this whole idea, we pop back in at least once a year. So who knows? We might do it again at some point down the road. I actually think it'd be fun to do one at the end of episode 9 in a year from now, so that we can actually talk about that saga as a whole, because I think it'd be really a fascinating discussion. So
I like that idea. I'm definitely down for it. But John, I have to tell you, I appreciate it because of the fact that I've made a friend with you as a result of all of this, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate your friendship, and I appreciate the time I get to nerd out and talk Star Wars. I love it anytime I get to. Doesn't matter who it's with. Doesn't matter what platform it's on. I could nerd out and talk all day long and all night long about Star Wars. Drives my family nuts, my wife specifically, but you know what? That's just what I do. I'll nerd out and talk about it anytime, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate you.
Thank you. And I hope you guys enjoyed this, who are listening to this episode and are on Fate of Heroes. For those of you that didn't hear our previous series, Cloud City Council, I don't have anywhere I can point you to it, but I will say it was a lot of fun. If you're interested in us doing more of these kind of like one-off things and maybe going back and doing more kind of Star Wars oriented things, let us know, because we always want to know that kind of stuff, and you can do that via our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Fate of Heroes. You can contact me on Discord through our Distractions Media Discord channel. You can contact me on Twitter at LinsteadDM, and that's pretty much how you can find me on pretty much everything these days. And Alan, where can they contact you?
Well, you can find me. All you have to do is type in JediZaugg. That's Zaugg, JediZaugg. You'll find me on Facebook. You'll find me on Twitter. I'm not going to necessarily take too much time to plug things that I do, but I do have a regular Star Wars podcast where I do get to chat with a couple of very good friends as well. So, and that's Idiots Array. So, it's something I enjoy doing. And if we pick this up again and do this, if those listening decide you want to do this again, I am totally game on that. You let me know. You let me know the deets, and we're on it. I will do it.
Awesome. Sounds good to me. But at least until next time and until next week when we go back to our regularly scheduled programming, you all have yourselves a great day. Be good to yourselves and be good to each other, and we'll see you later. Bye. This podcast is not endorsed by Lucasfilms Limited or by the Disney Corporation. This podcast is intended for entertainment and information purposes only.